Hello, this is the narrated PowerPoint on Study Unit 2 called Things. In this study unit, we are going to look at the definition of a thing, the characteristics of a thing, and you will then on your own look at the classification of a thing. Classification of things are done properly and extensively in the prescribed textbook as well as the alternative online textbooks. Please refer to the textbooks, the specific pages in the textbooks, summarize classification of things, and also make sure that you incorporate it into your notes and understand how one classifies things. The question around classification of things is really to determine what type of thing you are dealing with, because the type of thing that you are dealing with will determine the extent of the rights and also remedies that can be exercised and used for the protection of a right in the specific thing. Also, how the thing can be acquired, in other words, how perhaps ownership can be acquired over the thing, also has an impact on, or rather is subject to, the type of thing that one deals with. So it's very important that you can distinguish between different types of things so that you can know how the thing can be acquired, rights can be exercised over the thing, and also how remedies can be used to, and which remedies can be used to protect the thing. Alright, so when looking at the definition of a thing, the question here is whether the legal object qualifies as a thing for purposes of the law of things. And the related question then is, why is it important to determine whether a legal object qualifies as a thing? Now, the answer to this question is that the rules and principles of the law of things can only be applied to things. In other words, the rights and remedies that we find in the law of things can only be relied on if the legal object over which a dispute exists qualifies as a thing. Now, when determining whether an object qualifies as a thing, the distinction between property and things that we drew in the first narration must be kept in mind. Remember that the broader field of property law in which the law of things is located regulates a wider variety of legal objects called property. Property refers to objects that forms part of a person's estate and includes a wide variety of objects of corporeal and incorporeal nature, meaning tangible property and intangible property, while things is a subcategory of property and only refers to a certain genus of property. For a legal object or property to qualify as a thing, it must have certain characteristics. In other words, the characteristics associated with things tells us if a given legal object qualifies as a thing and may be regulated by the law of things. These characteristics are derived from the definition ordinarily ascribed to things. So what is the definition of a thing? Much like the definition of property, the definition of a thing is also very contentious. There is no real consensus as to what a thing constitutes. In other words, there's disagreement as to what a thing should constitute. But because of the important gatekeeping function that the definition of things has, there is a working definition that is regarded as acceptable. Now, what is this gatekeeping function? The gatekeeping function limits the type of objects that can qualify as a thing and be regulated by the law of things by prescribing specific characteristics. In other words, these characteristics ensures that only a specific genus of property, or rather in its broader sense, legal objects, can qualify as things and therefore can then receive protection and also enforcement within the context or the legal field rather of the law of property. So we've indicated that it's this gatekeeping function that has sort of forced scholars to in some way agree on a working definition. Now, what is this working definition of a thing? The working definition is that a thing is defined as an independent corporeal object that is appropriable of an impersonal nature, meaning it is outside of the human body and that has use and. Now, the working definition of a thing tells us that an object that qualifies as a thing ordinarily must have specific characteristics. Now, these characteristics are independence, corporeality, it must be of an impersonal nature, it must also be appropriable, and it must have use and value. Now let's have a closer look at each of these characteristics to determine exactly what they entail. The first characteristic of a thing that we're looking at is independence. A legal object must have independence to qualify as a thing, meaning it must have independent existence. In this sense, the object must constitute an independent juridical or legal entity. Now, how do we determine whether an object qualifies as an independent legal entity? Our point of departure is to look at whether the object is physically independent or has physical independence. Physical independence is a good indicator of whether the object can be described as juridically or legally independent. Let's look at two examples. The first example is of a house. Okay. The question is the house legally independent? A house is attached to the ground. Therefore, the house part is not legally independent. Physically, it is not independent. And therefore, the house cannot be seen as removed from the land. It is not an independent object. So in itself, it doesn't have legal independence. Another example is fruit in a tree. While it is physically attached to the tree. Now, in terms of the point of departure physical independence test, the question is whether the fruit is independent. And the answer is as follows. No, the fruit is not independent. It forms part of the tree while it is attached. So physically, it is not independent. And therefore, while it is attached to the tree, it's also not regarded as legally independent. Only once it is removed and it is physically independent is it regarded as legally independent. Although physical independence is a good starting point, it is not decisive because the focus is not on physical independence but rather on legal independence. In other words, yes, we use physical independence as a starting point to indicate whether or not something is legally independent, but it is not the be-all and end-all test. To have legal independence, the object must have meaning in itself. So there is a second leg to this legal independence test. Point of departure is the physical independence test, but then we have the second leg that requires us to determine whether the object has meaning in itself. Now, example of where an object does not have meaning in itself is as follows. Now, although keys are physically independent objects, they are not legally independent. Because if we ask, do they have meaning in themselves? The answer is no. Keys are seen as mediums through which people can get access to other things. Therefore, keys only have meaning when they are viewed with other components or other objects. And these other objects can be a car, as indicated in the illustration on the slide. It can be a house. It can be a safe. So if you have a key goes with another object, either a house, car, safe, just to name a few. Therefore, physical independence is not decisive for juridical independence. We must also ask whether the object has meaning in itself to have legal independence. So as indicated in the previous slide, for an object to have legal independence, the second leg of the test requires that it must have meaning in itself. However, there are other instances in which objects are regarded to have independent legal existence, in other words, are regarded as being independent legal entities because the law made them legal independent entities. And this creation of this legal independence by way of the law can take place through legislation or case law. An example of where the law steps in and makes an object a legal independent entity can be found in how sectional title units in apartment blocks are viewed as legal independent entities. Now, a sectional title unit is physically part of the apartment block, as illustrated in the picture on this slide. It's one building, but it is by way of legislation deemed to be an independent legal object. So in other words, it's legally independent. So although the building is one building, each apartment in the building is deemed by way of legislation to be an independent legal object or to be legally independent. Therefore, by virtue of the legislation regarding the unit to be independent, it obtains legal independence, although it is physically not independent from the building. So this example of where something is regarded as legally independent by way of the law also shows us how physical independence isn't a conclusive indicator of whether or not something is legally independent. The second characteristic of a thing is corporeality, and it must be noted that it is a controversial characteristic. Before we get to the controversy, let's first get a good understanding of and grasp of the concept of corporeality. So what does corporeality entail? An object is corporeal if it is tangible. An object is tangible if it can be appreciated with the five senses and if it takes up space. Now, example of something that can be appreciated with the senses and that can take up space, or examples rather, are, for instance, a house, a car, your textbook, your laptop, paper. Those are all examples of things that can be perceived with the senses and takes up space. So they are regarded as tangible and corporeal. Now, the opposite of corporeality or of a corporeal object is an incorporeal object. Now, incorporeal objects refers to non-physical types of property that cannot be perceived with the senses and does not necessarily take up space. In other words, it is intangible, meaning it cannot be appreciated with the senses and does not take up space. Notably, incorporeal objects is becoming increasingly important in private, commercial, and public spheres of life. Examples of incorporeal objects would be, for instance, rights in or over other legal rights, such as, for instance, use rights over mineral rights or in mineral rights. Another example of incorporeal object would be forms of energy, wind, heat, radioactivity, electricity, and even financial instruments such as shares and Bitcoin. Now, due to the increasing importance of these objects, the corporeality characteristic of things is heavily debated. Two diverging views or groups can be identified in this debate. The first group argues for a strict or inflexible approach to the application of the corporeality requirement when considering whether objects qualify as things for purposes of protection and regulation under the law of things. This means that only corporeal objects that also satisfies the other characteristics of a thing that we will have a look at shortly will qualify as thing. The characteristics must be seen as essential requirements and not merely as guidelines. So this is the submission of the group that advocates for a strict or inflexible approach to the corporeality requirement. On the other hand, however, there's a second group, and this second group argues for a flexible approach to be adopted. One that approaches or deals with the corporeality characteristic as a guideline and not as a strict requirement. This submission supports the idea that incorporeals can also qualify as things, since corporeality must only be treated as a guideline. And the same rationale then must be applied to the other characteristics of a thing that we will look at shortly, that they must also be seen as mere guidelines and not strict essential requirements for something to qualify as a thing. Regarding this debate, I will need you to go back to your textbook and self-study the reasons for and against inclusion of incorporeals as things. Also determine what approach is taken by the South African courts and legislator in this regard. So just for ease of reference, I've put up what you specifically need to look at when you self-study this bit on the slide. So just by way of example, since we've now looked at the corporeality requirement, we see that corporeal objects or examples of corporeal objects rather can be bicycles, it can be your phone because they're tangible, you can perceive them with your senses and they take up space. Examples again of incorporeal objects would be financial instruments. We've already indicated Bitcoin would qualify, as well as forces of nature such as lightning.